technology to sort itself out here. The video, the audio, and the Facebook control panel have all got to synchronize with each other. So I think we are probably up and running. Anyway, good evening, everybody. This is the Angel Mountain Show, episode 6 of 7. I shall do another one tomorrow evening just to round things off in this little group of chats. And this evening I want to talk about the eccentrics in the stories. Shakespeare realized a very long time ago that every good story needed a few eccentrics just to brighten things up a bit, to provide some light relief here and there when the story might otherwise be quite a dark one. And he appreciated, genius that he was, that you had to vary the mood and the pace of things by throwing in some entertaining characters here and there. He often referred to them as the rude mechanicals, which means that they were sort of an underclass, really. But of course, a lot of the eccentrics in Shakespearean plays are not from the underclass at all. Many of them are very sophisticated people. And so I've tried in the Angel Mountain stories to do the same sort of thing, to give light relief through some of the characters who are quite important to Martha, and through other characters who have little cameo roles. They just appear in one of the novels and then they disappear again and are never seen again. One of the novels in which I have had most fun with these rather eccentric characters is the one called Guardian Angel. Martha, of course, is fairly eccentric herself, and maybe she should be included here in this category. But in Guardian Angel, anyway, she, as readers will know, she dies in the previous novel and then she resurrects herself in this one. And in Guardian Angel, she's actually called Susanna Ravenhill. I told you she was eccentric. Anyway, it's a fairly complicated story, but one of the characters I quite enjoyed creating was a police constable in the little town of Newcastle Emlyn, where Susanna goes on her travels because she's fleeing from enemies, more imagined than real, it has to be said. And in writing this little role for Sergeant David Gruffydd, the local police constable, I had in mind a character that my father told me about once, whose name was Tom Twice, because he said everything twice. He couldn't resist repeating himself in almost every sentence. And so Martha has quite an entertaining conversation with Sergeant David Gruffydd before he disappears from the story. And he keeps on saying things like this. He was not a gentleman of my acquaintance and was indeed a stranger to me. Or like this, I must now depart and indeed take my leave. Or he might say, the most senior and least junior of magistrates. And another thing he says was, I will return very shortly and as soon as may be. And so Martha pokes fun at him without him realizing it. He's not a very sensitive individual. But it's quite nice to throw people like this into the story now and then. Another character who appears in Guardian Angel is a slightly villainous character called Jonas Harry, who is a bit of a sort of James Bond villain type of character. He's disabled, actually. Martha doesn't realize it at first when she meets him, but he is actually carried around by his servants. And he believes that Martha is out to do him down. He gets completely the wrong end of the stick and assumes that she is trying to destroy his business enterprises and to take over all his assets herself. Gets completely the wrong end of the stick. And Martha has a series of quite entertaining run-ins with him. He's probably suffers from consumption or TB, but he's not a well man. He's a sallow complexion, very wasted. But he's quite intellectually very sharp and very bright. And so Martha has quite an entertaining time trying to get the better of him, as indeed she does. And in doing so, gets a lot of respect for him as well. And they end up on quite good terms. Guardian Angel, by the way, is probably the least violent of all of the novels. It's really more of a fairy tale than a romance or a work of serious fiction. Another character who I've quite a lot of fun with in all of the books, actually, is a character called Will Owen, who's the son of Mrs. Owen, that the ferocious housekeeper. And Will is an interesting character because he's quite bright actually, but he starts off life as a labourer, but he gets in with the low life in town, gets involved in petty crime. He's constantly getting into trouble because he has ambitions really to be a businessman, and so he's always got some little enterprise going. A little bit of smuggling and buying and selling of stuff, handling of stolen goods, petty pilfering, and so on and so forth. For he's frequently in trouble, and Martha frequently has to rescue Will from the lockup in town. And there are a number of episodes in the stories which I found quite fun to write, during which Martha has to go down to town, confront the police constable, and actually manage to get Will released before he gets charged with anything and hauled up before the magistrates. And she manages more or less to keep him out of trouble, following a whole series of rather peculiar episodes. In one of which he actually is caught by the customs men in the middle of the night with a load of smuggled alcohol, and claims that he always operates at night because he runs this thing called the Newport Nocturnal Delivery Service. And to her eternal credit, Martha, when she goes to try to rescue him from the lockup, actually goes along with this story and repeats it almost word for word, and protests to the constable that this is all perfectly true and that the wine is actually hers and it's already paid for through a proper legal transaction, and so on and so forth. Another very interesting character who appears in Guardian Angel is the Emperor of China. People might be a little bit surprised to find the Emperor of China in a novel set in West Wales. But Martha in Guardian Angel, in the guise of Susanna Ravenhill, goes to Merthyr Tydfil. She actually travels around quite a lot in this story. And while she's in Merthyr Tydfil, she's moved to help the poor of the district. Appalling conditions existed at that time, of course, because the ironworks were in full swing. It was a raucous, rowdy, filthy place, Merthyr Tydfil, and all the towns and villages round about, all completely devoted to the ironmasters and their enterprises, exploited and living in abject poverty and starvation very often. Martha tries to help a lot of these people, and she gets involved in Chinatown, this place called China, which actually existed. And in China, all sorts of pimps and prostitutes and pickpockets and petty thieves. There were probably people serious or guilty of very serious crimes there as well. And they lived in a network of tunnels and chambers dug into the slag heaps. They almost like a group of cave-dwelling people. And the police had no control over this area whatsoever. And the ruler of this territory was the Emperor of China. It was actually a man called John Wilde, who had a rather exotic wife as well. And Martha is hauled up before him because somebody accuses her of being a spy. And Martha develops a rather interesting relationship with him. And he's desperate to escape to America because he's in big trouble. He knows that he's going to come to a sticky end if he stays in Merthyr Tydfil and in China, because the law will eventually start to catch up with everybody there. And Martha agrees to sell a painting, which is, or to restore a painting that has been stolen from one of the gentry houses in the community. And she restores the painting. She obtains a reward for its return, and she hands the reward over to the Emperor of China, upon which he and his wife actually do manage then to emigrate to America, and they disappear out of the story. So he's a very colourful character, and it was quite fun to actually write a little bit about him. Another character who appears in the stories is the very famous individual called Iolo Morganwg, who of course was the inventor of Druidism, more or less, and the inventor of the national Eisteddfod and the tradition of Eisteddfodau that of course exists in Wales today. Extraordinary character, but he appears in Rebecca and the Angels. Martha tries to get his help to sort out political and social injustices, etc. But she discovers that Iolo is only interested in culture and in fantasy, and he's slightly mad anyway. So he drifts into the story and drifts back out again. Another character who I've had a lot of fun writing about is Beau Brummel. He appears in the story. He's a real figure, of course. He was the leading dandy of the Regency period. He was a crony of the Prince of Wales. And for a number of years, he was the darling of society. And in Conspiracy of Angels, Martha goes to Keswick Hall in the Lake District as the guest of Sir Dudley and Lady Alice Stokes. And she stays there for a couple of weeks in a very lavish house party. And one of the guests is Beau Brummel. He's the centre of attraction, of course. He sees himself as the most fashionable man in the country, spends hours preparing himself for every appearance in public. Anyway, he takes a shine to Martha and decides that he's going to seduce Martha. And in one of the scenes I've enjoyed writing most, I suppose, he finds his way into Martha's bedroom in Keswick Hall in the middle of the night. And he appears there in the moonlight, stark naked. And Martha has to deal with a rather ticklish situation. And he's very drunk as well. He's quite determined that he's going to seduce her. And Martha plays for time for a little while, and eventually she knocks him on the head with a chamber pot and knocks him unconscious. And then eventually raises the alarm and gets him slung out on the pretext that he was probably a burglar up to no good. Everybody knows, however, what was really happening. And on the following day, of course, Beau Brummel takes his leave in disgrace, disappears from Keswick Hall, and is not seen again in the story. And Martha, of course, becomes the heroine of the day because not very many people have, until that point, found a way of dealing with Beau Brummel, who ended up in abject poverty and completely insane, actually, and died in rather sad circumstances in Caen, in France. And then the final person, perhaps, that we ought to mention is Wilcox Gwynne. He's a very eccentric character. He appears in a number of the stories, and he is a man who has come from the copper industry of the Swansea area, and he's a typical character from the period when merchants were beginning to have aspirations to join the gentry. And Wilcox Gwynne is a self-made man. He's become a very wealthy industrialist. He suffers from lung disease because he's been inhaling the smoke from the copper industry. His hands are gnarled and battered and injured as well. So he's not a well man. And he's a very rough diamond, but he appears on the scene. He decides to buy an estate in West Wales and becomes a near neighbour of Martha. And he appears out of the blue one day at Plas Ingley and meets Martha there in the company of his rather exotic wife, who's called Delilah, an extremely large lady who wears diaphanous gowns and things. And they're quite a comedy duo, the pair of them. And everybody looks on Wilmot as a weird character who's rather beneath contempt because of his upbringing. But as the story evolves, one realizes that Wilmot is more of a gentleman than any of the local gentry, in fact. He is genuinely a gentle man. As they say in France, he's gentil. And he is incredibly supportive of Martha, very empathetic, and he gradually wins the respect of the other gentry simply because he has such a good heart and finds ways to support Martha when times really do get very difficult for her. And his ultimate compassionate move is to react when Martha has handed the estate over to Brynach, her son. Brynach does something that Martha would never have done. He borrows money in order to try to keep the estate going. And the money that he's borrowed, the loan is called in, and the estate is bankrupted, and it has to be disposed of. And at that point, Martha is distraught, obviously, but Wilmot steps in, buys the estate because he can afford it, and allows Martha to stay there until the end of her days. So he's an eccentric, but he's also a good and gentle man who represents, I think, for the purposes of the story, this rather strange thing called sensibility, which is something, of course, that Jane Austen was also somewhat concerned about. Okay, so that's just a glimpse of some of the characters who wander in and wander back out again from the story. I hope that'll at least give you some impression of some of the light relief that we can find. There are very many funny episodes actually in the stories, although for a lot of the time there is extreme violence and a rather dark and somber mood that pervades the stories. Anyway, I've got one more talk to go, and tomorrow in this little group of 7, and tomorrow at 7 o'clock, I will say a little bit about Martha herself, her virtues and her vices, because she's a very complicated and a very imperfect heroine. So thank you for listening and watching this evening. Keep safe, keep well, and if all being well, I hope to see you again tomorrow at 7 o'clock for the last of this little series of chats. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.